Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever it is that you are joining us from. We are just allowing a few moments for everyone to sign on. We've just passed the 200 mark of 200 participants arriving from all over the globe. Different countries, different time zones, different situations, all coming to, in their own way, be part of this work on Lacan's Seminar 17, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis. As you are aware, this is a seminar organized by the London Society of the New Lacanian School within the ambit of the New Lacanian School and beyond the English-speaking community of the Lacanian orientation of the World Association of Psychoanalysis. This work is one way to bring us all together, sustaining, shall we say, the possibility to work something under the conditions under which we find ourselves. It's also a way to help us formulate, to locate some of the questions and some of the challenges that we find ourselves confronted with under these conditions. And also perhaps to situate ourselves a bit better, to respond more precisely to some of the demands that we find addressed to us under these conditions in our clinical practice. Today, we will be taking on Chapter 3, Knowledge, a Means of Jouissance, which, as anyone who will have spent a little time working this chapter will acknowledge, is there are no easy chapters in the seminar, but this one we could say is a particularly fiendish chapter for us to untangle, to grapple with. We are fortunate today to have the assistance of Florencia Shanahan to guide us through some of the aspects of this text. Florencia is a founder member of the ICLO, the Irish Circle of the Lacanian orientation. She is licenciado in psychology from the National University of La Plata in Argentina, which means that she is certainly qualified to speak to us about the distinction between the university discourse and the analytic discourse. It also happens that she is an analyst of the school, which means that she has reached the end of her analysis and passed through the procedure of the pass, receiving the nomination Analyst of the School. Some of you will have heard her present her first testimony at the inaugural NLS study day on the pass in Ghent last September, in what now seems to be a completely different epoch. Now, the role of Analyst of the School is indeed a teaching role, but primarily in the sense of testimony, giving testimony to what her experience of analysis has taught her about the relation between knowledge and jouissance, amongst other things. We are thus fortunate to find ourselves in a position of hearing her today testify to us in her own way of her own experience of grappling with this wonderful chapter of Lacan's seminar, which Jacques has titled for us, Knowledge, Means of Jouissance. Now, before I hand over to Florencia to introduce some of the questions for us to elaborate in this text, I will also take the opportunity to mention that amongst her various roles and activities, she is currently also the editor, facilitator, and coordinator of the Lacanian Review Online. Any of you who might still not be familiar with LRO, the Lacanian Review Online, can make a note to go immediately to the website of the LRO, where you will be able to find an archive of recent texts and also sign up to receive future mailings. Those of you who are already inscribed within the LRO network will not need to be told what a wonderful resource this has turned out to be, particularly under the current conditions, in creating some kind of operative network for the transmission of the Lacanian orientation, extending throughout the English-speaking ambit of the new Lacanian school and far beyond. We are thus privileged to hear Florencia Shanahan speak to us about knowledge as a means of jouissance. Florencia.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank each one of you for being here. I'd like to thank Roger Litten, Chair of the London Society, and Peggy Papada, who invited me to participate in this wonderful initiative. It couldn't be more timely. I have a long history of working with the London Society. In fact, when I first moved to Ireland, it was the place where I turned to, given that it's, well, let's say, close enough. And therefore, it's always my pleasure to collaborate. And since that time, some 15 years ago, the London Society and ICLO have done many things together. So I'm delighted that this is one of them. I was thinking that the best thing about this really is to see all of you, even if it's as little squares on a screen. It really gives me a lot of joy to see my colleagues, my friends from all around the world. Some of you I only get a chance to see maybe once a year, sometimes not even that. So I'm very happy to be here today. And I thank you all for making it possible. As Roger said, I found this a very difficult chapter. Very, what happened to me is that in reading it, I couldn't find exactly where to, how to get grip of it. And I don't think that's by chance. I think it has to do with the nature of the obstacle that Lacan is trying to circumscribe, to isolate, to formulate. So I prepared something that is written. I'm going to read and try to comment also. I don't think that the relationship between knowledge and jouissance can be reduced to the title of this chapter, but it's one way of introducing that relationship, which is the relationship of the terms that constitute the analytic experience as such. If one does an analysis, is, as Roger was saying, precisely because something in the relationship between knowledge and jouissance is fundamentally, let's say, inadequate for the speaking being. And in any case, the solutions that one might have found in one's life to respond to this inadequacy reveal themselves insufficient, or reveal themselves to be to bring about an excess of suffering. And that's why one goes eventually to see an analyst. The other thing that I was going to say by means of introduction is, and Roger also mentioned it, I was talking a little bit with Peggy because we were both quite early joining the Zoom universe this morning. And effectively, there is a lot to be said about the relationships between the university discourse and the analytic discourse, as well as the master's discourse and the hysterics discourse. But I think it's important to situate that the framework within which this questioning takes its full weight is within Lacan. Doesn't stop repeating it. Every text you read, he says it again. It's the framework of the practice of psychoanalysis as such. So one could say that the university discourse, the master's discourse, the hysterics discourse, of course, we can use them as tools, as conceptual tools to speak about many things, but they only interest us within the frame of the psychoanalytic experience. So the question about the, as Lacan calls it, the antipathy between the university discourse and the analytic discourse has nothing to do as such with universities. I'm talking about buildings and courses and master's degrees and PhDs, and they function with a logic that is their own. The same, the master's discourse. What interests us and what interested Lacan is to what extent those discourses are at play in what he calls the grouping of analysts. And this is what he never stops repeating. All that interests him with his teaching is to speak to analysts information. The only reason for his teaching is the transmission of psychoanalysis from its practice. So what's more important for us is to situate within our analytic communities. We can think about it as a knot of three, where we have the clinic, the theory or the epistemic dimension, and the politics. Yeah, it's a knot, three rings. Each of them, according to what idea you have of each, will determine what happens in the other. So depending on what, Lacan says this very clearly in 1956, when he makes a clear diagnosis according to his teaching of what the derailings or the deviations of psychoanalysis after Freud have been, the notion of the unconscious that you have will determine what you do in practice and will determine how you conceive of the institution or the organization whereby analysts give themselves a group for the transmission of psychoanalysis. And again, what you do in the clinic at the same time will define the way you understand certain concepts and how they operate. When we say the ring of politics, we mean, this is something that Jacques Miller has developed extensively, we mean two things. The grouping of analysts, what kind of organization do analysts give themselves in order to transmit psychoanalysis, and the end of analysis. In other words, what is the conception of what the analytic experience produces as a product? And this is where the theory of the four discourses gets its full strength, because the product of a discourse, as we are seeing, is not the same in each of the discourses. But just to use that as a preliminary, that if we're interested in the notions of the university discourse and the master's discourse, is not to say things about what happens outside of psychoanalysis. Even though I'm sure in the discussion we will have plenty of opportunity to speak, especially of the situation of psychoanalysis in 2020, to paraphrase that writing by Lacan, in the English-speaking world and in the transmission of Lacan's work in the English-speaking world. So, it's the beginning of 1970. It's after the new year. It's actually the 14th of January of 1970. A new decade is beginning, and Lacan starts this lesson with an apparently innocuous remark. It's not evident, he says, that what he's writing on the board will be legible. This is the first thing he says. And he adds, not because you haven't been presented with it already, since he had written the formulae of the discourses on the board the previous week. Another remark follows. Lacan says, at a time when everyone is rejoicing at entering a new decade, he will turn this into an opportunity for looking back over what the previous decade had given him. So already he says, you're all very happy to enter a new decade. I'm going to use this to look over what the previous decade has given me. We can see how with these two comments, Lacan introduces straight away a major question for psychoanalysis. What is the past? And what place does the past have in the analytic experience? Simultaneously, this goes straight to the core of the problem that Lacan is dealing with in this chapter. The problem of repetition, and more specifically, repetition in its relation to knowledge. It is then not by chance that the first section is dedicated to something that Lacan had been writing the previous month and which is dated on Christmas 1969. This text is published in the Autres Écrits on page 393 under the title Preface to a Thesis. It's the preface to the book Jacques Lacan, a work by Annika Riflet-Lemaire, published in Brussels in 1970. Jacques-Alain Miller entitles this section, How Am I Translated? And no doubt Lacan tries to advance in his attempt to establish, I quote, what are the conditions of a properly psychoanalytic discourse? This is a question that we can use as a red thread throughout, I would say, this chapter, but also this seminar. And in fact, Lacan's work as a whole. What are the conditions of a properly psychoanalytic discourse? As it's often the case, he tries to advance by stating what something is not. So he comments on this piece of writing that he produced as a preface to this thesis, which is a thesis that bears his name, Jacques Lacan. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of the go that Lacan is having at the two L's, Lagache and Leclerc, Henri, etc. But I'm going to read out a few sentences of what he wrote in this preface. More precisely, what he wrote at the beginning and at the end. And you can find, for your reference, an English translation by David Massey, published by Routledge in 1977. Lacan states there, "My écrits are unsuitable for a thesis, particularly an academic thesis. They are antithetical by nature. One either takes what they formulate or one leaves them." So it's what current psychology would call very black and white. Each of them, he continues, is apparently no more than a memorial to the refusal of my discourse by the audience it included. An audience restricted to psychoanalysts. But precisely by including them without retaining them, each article shows by a further twist that there is no knowledge without discourse. An unthinkable knowledge, because it could only be held if one was ejected from it. Perfectly teachable, however, by a half-saying, a technique which realizes that truth can only be half-said. This presupposes that the psychoanalyst never shows himself except in an asymptomatic discourse, which is, in effect, at least, the least one can expect of him. In fact, this impossible is the basis of his real, a real from within which the consistency of the discourses in which truth limps can be judged. Precisely because it limps openly, as opposed to the inanity of the discourse of knowledge, which asserting itself with its closure makes the others lie. That indeed is the operation of academic discourse when it makes a thesis out of the fiction it calls an author, out of the history of thought, or out of something that styles itself progress. So we see already there in this presentation of the thesis how Lacan is not objecting to this kind of academic work, but it's trying to formalize what is the place that it corresponds to it, that number one, and number two, what are the structural effects that producing an academic thesis, as he calls it, when it makes a thesis out of the fiction it calls an author, what are the effects of this going to be? And my interest in this is precisely that we can, in the discussion with everyone who's here today as a panelist, to interrogate, is it possible for us to say something of these effects in our present time, in the conditions that we find ourselves in for the transmission of psychoanalysis, especially in the situation that we find ourselves in today, where it's become a burning question. Again, what are the conditions proper for a properly psychoanalytic discourse? And Lacan ends the preface by saying that the interest of this kind of texts will be, I quote, that they transmit what he has said literally, like the amber which holds the fly so as to know nothing of its flight. Yeah, I don't know, it depends on the generation, but for me it was Jurassic Park immediately, the reference. So as to know nothing, this sums up Lacan's view of academia. Wanting to know nothing about the flight, I read this with the clues that Vicente Palomera gave us last week. Freezing the statements, freezing what is said, keeping the information and erasing the enunciation, which is in a way precisely the opposite of what one aims at doing in an analysis, where eventually the statements are reduced to the core of satisfaction that mobilizes them, that makes them exist. It's a question whether this can be separated from the body that speaks. And this is something that we can relate to very easily in our own experience. If you think about what your experience of attending a lecture, what your experience of preparing a thesis, what your experience of listening to a teacher is. However, as I said, I think it's more interesting to remind ourselves that Lacan is addressing those who have entered in a certain way the experience of the practice of psychoanalysis. And the question is, what I think Peggy published this today on the Facebook page early this morning, one of the quotes that I chose from this chapter. What defines the analyst's position? That's the compass. Effectively, we might hope that what defines the analyst's position is not framed or directed by this to know nothing of the flight. This, however, did not prevent Lacan to continue the movement of interrogating how can psychoanalysis teach what cannot be taught. So we have to live with this paradox, and we have to live with this dilemma, because you know that the context of this seminar is also the context of the conditions for the teaching of psychoanalysis, the creation of the Department of Psychoanalysis in the university, the constitution of the clinical section as a place for teaching, etc. Yeah, so it's not a matter of saying we build a wall and this is this and this is that. Lacan never produces solutions of that kind, despite the black and whiteness. So that's the paradox we have to bear. It's a matter of being aware that the analytic discourse does not think itself as being the truth. He says this 8 years later, at the Department of Psychoanalysis at Vincennes. And he puts it in the form of a question. Might the antipathy between the university and analytic discourse be overcome at Vincennes? Certainly not. It's being put to work there. It's apparent that by coming up against its own impossibility, teaching is refreshed. You can find that reference in the volume number 1 of Culture and Clinic, the text that begins with the famous phrase, there are 4 discourses. This is also what Lacan is proposing for the second section of this lesson, guided by the following question. What is the element of impossibility at the basis of an effect of structure for each discourse? You find that on page 45 of Seminar 17. What is the element of impossibility? He states this after going around a bit, trying to formalize what is what he calls the dominant for each discourse. He tells his audience that he's not finding points of certainty when it comes to establishing what the dominant is for the university discourse. In the master's discourse, he says it's the law. In the hysterics discourse, it's the symptom. In the analytic discourse, or the discourse of the analyst, is the reject. And this is also what he had written very clearly in the preface to the thesis. Each écrit is apparently no more than a memorial to the refusal of my discourse. We see there the intertwining of his writings as part of the knotting between the position of the analyst and the responsibility for the transmission of the practice that analysis constitutes. It's not a choice. It's not one or the other. There is a knot there that each of us has to resolve. This is why in the paragraph of the preface that I just read, he said, an unthinkable discourse because it could only be held if one was ejected from it. Lacan thus spells out here what the analyst's position is made of at this point of his teaching. It is made from the object A. That's a quote from this lesson. The analyst's position is made from the object A. It's not exactly the same to say it's made of the object A. Unfortunately, I didn't have the French version, but I put that to my colleagues as well for maybe a little commentary. It's at this point that Lacan will get into what Jacques Miller formalized as discursive jouissance. Jacques Miller locates this as the 5th in his 6 paradigms of jouissance. Maybe there are some of you who don't know this text, but for me, this is truly Jacques Miller at his best, in the sense of Jacques Miller elucidating the transmission of the work of Jacques Lacan. Elucidating means formalizing, reducing, extracting this text, which is the text that existed in English for some time, in a translation that we can include among the exercises of translation that Lacan is talking about when he doesn't complain, but he situates that he situates what happens when people translate him. Well, we can say the same of this, but thanks to the London Society, the psychoanalytical notebooks, and especially thanks to Janet Haney and Roger Litten, since last December, we have another translation. So I invite everyone to read this new translation of the 6 paradigms of Jouissance, which is taken, and this is what's quite striking, from Miller's course of 1999, The Experience of the Real in the Psychoanalytic Treatment. But curiously enough, these particular lessons are based on some lectures that he gave in Los Angeles in English, but of which, allegedly, or so are we told, there are no records. So you see how interesting it becomes, the question of what's translated gets lost forever, and how does it become readable or legible for us in the Anglophone world? You see how accurate proves to be Lacan's remark when he says, the difficulty endemic to translating me. This is an expression he uses on page 41. The difficulty endemic to translating me. And he's not talking about translating from one language to the other. He's precisely speaking about translating him from one discourse to the other. So accurate that it proves the very point Lacan is trying to make with regards to the impossibility inherent to every discourse. The question of what is impossible to translate is not far from what this chapter deals with. As I said at the beginning, the issue of repetition. If before, let's say, and I'm following Jacques-Alain Miller's paradigms of jouissance here, in seminar 16, the question had been, how is the organism, the living being, the libido, captured by the structure, considering that the structure, the other, the dialectic, were always pre-existent, were always prior to the subject. Yes, with formulas such as the unconscious is the discourse of the other, or the other, the big other, is always prior. If that was the case before, what changes with the notion of discourse is the idea that the relationship between signifier and jouissance is a primitive and primal relationship. This leads to the main thesis developed in this third lesson, namely, I quote, that there is a primitive relationship of knowledge and jouissance, of signifiers and jouissance. And this, according to Miller, signals once and for all the ceasing of the autonomy of the symbolic. Not just its primacy, but its autonomy with regards to the real and the imaginary. As everything in the facts, says Lacan in this lesson, in clinical experience indicate to us, repetition is based on the return of jouissance. So you see how there's the sliding from repetition as the return of the repressed in terms of the signifiers, the symbolic elements that had been removed, let's say, from the signifying chain, or as Lacan put it before, somewhere, the hidden chapter of the subject's history that the analysis is supposed to bring to light or to put into words. And he continues, what in this connection is well spelled out by Freud himself is that in this very repetition, something is produced that is a defect, a failure. So we are faced with the problem of reconciling through the concept of repetition something that was already highlighted and worked on by Marie-Ellen Bruce at the first meeting of this seminar, the issue of loss and gain in terms of knowledge and of jouissance. We could also say that an analysis can be summarized with this formulation. What is lost and what is gained in terms of knowledge and in terms of jouissance. The problem of what constitutes a limit to jouissance and at the same time a production of jouissance. Yeah, we have to again stay a little bit with this paradox. But we must not lose sight of the fact that this is no ontological quest on the part of Lacan, nor is it a genetic quest in the sense of looking for a supposed primal element. What, in my view, Lacan is trying to do here is to elaborate further his proposal that the analyst's position is made from the object A. This is immediately the problem of inscription, of memory. It's a Freudian problem. And therefore, of writing. This is why I said at the start that it's the problem of the past. And also, what occurs to me now is that it's also the problem of analysis terminable and interminable. You see how it's at the heart of what we called the political ring, the grouping of analysts and the end of analysis, and that knot that will determine the position of both the clinic and the theory. By virtue of something being repeated, that it can only be in a position of loss with regards to that which is repeated, says Lacan in this lesson. This is Freud insisting that in repetition itself, there is a reduction in jouissance. And this, Lacan says, is a consequence of the human being subjected to the simplest form of mark, which is the origin of the signifier, namely the unary trait. This is, Lacan says, where we must look for what interests us, psychoanalysts, as knowledge. What interests us as knowledge, we have to look for it in the unary trait. One of the most complex things in this chapter, for me, is that we navigate various different statuses of the S1, and we can't really come to grasp exactly what type of S1 is Lacan talking about, at least for me. If the object A appears in the place of the loss produced by repetition, it follows that repetition is no longer a matter of the symbolic, but that it is directed at jouissance. And this is what Miller calls the primitive circularity between the signifier and jouissance that we find in this paradigm shift of the four discourses. A reading of what Lacan calls on page 49, the signifier introduced as an apparatus of jouissance. I think this formulation is crucial in this chapter, how language becomes the apparatus of jouissance. Hence, the recourse to the notion of entropy to describe the knowledge at work. Now, I'm not going to go into the entropy thing because for subjective reasons, my subjectivity doesn't allow me to understand almost nothing about physics or mathematics. So again, I leave room there for my colleagues to introduce their enlightenment with regards to this. But let's remember that Lacan was trying to establish what could be the term that could correspond to S1, to knowledge as dominant. Yeah, remember, we had the symptom, we had the law, we had the reject, and what is the term that corresponds to S2? That is to say, as the place of the agent in the university discourse. In other words, what does the work for? That's the question. And from where? And this question is only relevant insofar as they allow Lacan to advance in his formalization of what the position of the analyst ought to be. And here's that we find the quote that Peggy cited this morning. What defines an analyst? It's at the end of the lesson. Let's pay attention to the fact that Lacan doesn't ask, what is an analyst? What defines an analyst is that he can arrive at getting his knowledge to function in terms of truth. This is Lacan on page 53. And it is clear then that the question is, what is this knowledge? What is this knowledge that the analyst can get to function in terms of truth? It's not the one acquired in a university or in a clinical section or even in a reading seminar, not even in a cartel. Even if all of those elements are necessary for what we call the formation of an analyst. But the knowledge that can function in terms of truth is the one produced by the unconscious of which one was the subject during his own analysis. Let's go back for a little while to this notion of entropy. No, I'm not going to go back to that. I'm going to leave it. I'm happy to leave it be. Of course, there is the notion of disorder and order, to think in relation to this notion of entropy. There is also the notion of what gets wasted. There is also the notion of a movement that is increasing and cannot be reversed. And there's also the question of what useful work is. It's a question that I think many of us ask ourselves often. So Lacan explains that entropy takes over as surplus jouissance to be recovered, and the jouissance takes shape as a loss. This is, in a nutshell, the paradigm shift from his previous formulations. Jouissance is no longer accessed to by way of transgression, but by way of entropy. This is how Miller puts it. The wastage produced by the signifier. I find this a beautiful expression. The wastage produced by the signifier. And this is when Lacan can formulate that knowledge is a means of jouissance, and which indicates the renunciation to the autonomy of the symbolic. Knowledge is a means of jouissance in a double sense, in that it has the effect of a lack and in that it produces the supplement, the surplus jouissance. What defines the analyst's position, as Lacan says at the beginning of this lesson, what is it? To represent the object A. Those are the terms that Lacan uses at this point. What is at stake is to produce a double movement from this position. On the one hand, the analyst will go counter the unconscious knowledge. This is, of course, a paradox insofar as he will install the conditions for the production of this knowledge in the first place, of this articulated chain, in order to go against it. The discourse of the unconscious is the discourse of the master, and as such, as knowledge that works, it produces entropy. That which is revealed as the truth of the master, castration, lacking being, produces at the same time a compensation in the place of the object as surplus jouissance. The second movement of this double movement is the putting into place of the signifying order, the unfolding of the signifying chain and its concomitant production of knowledge, will give rise to the emergence of something which is no longer repetition at the level of the symbolic. The body as living substance takes on a different status in its relation with S1. We know, of course, that this will not get turned upside down again till seminar 20, but nevertheless, we can use that as our vantage point. That's why Lacan can say in this lesson that the mark in itself conducts, in the sense that the mark is a conductor of volupté, of lust. How are we conceived this S1? This is problematic. I've already said it. It's something that will become apparent in Lacan's further developments, especially a year later in Littérature, where he comes back to some of these topics and where the question of the equivalence between the gesture that marks and the body as object of jouissance is formalized differently. It's quite interesting to reread Littérature with this lesson in particular, because even though there isn't that much chronological time in between them, we can already find very different gaps that Lacan is pointing towards. In the fifth lesson of Seminar 17, titled The Lacanian Field, Lacan goes back to these questions and gives us some more precisions. We will surely be discussed again when we have the opportunity to listen to Patricia and Peggy in 2 weeks' time. But I'll just mention what he says there, that if Freud's first discovery was to say that the subject, speak, let's see what knowledge is that you encounter. This is the first Freud. The second Freud, his second discovery, the one of beyond the pleasure principle and the Wiederholungszwang, the repetition compulsion, is precisely that knowledge is a means of jouissance. The unconscious as repetition does not mean that one does something again because one hasn't finished it. Here, let's go back to the opening remark with which Lacan began this lesson. When he says, oh, the chalk is red or black, or it's not evident that what is written will be legible. Repetition is the precise denotation of a trait. The unary trait, the little stick, the element of writing insofar, this is page 77, as it is the commemoration of an eruption of jouissance. I'm going to read this sentence again. It doesn't belong to my chapter, but I needed it for my chapter. Repetition is the precise denotation of a trait, the unary trait, the little stick, the element of writing, insofar as it is the commemoration of an eruption of jouissance. And I will conclude with a quote from 1966, which is the year of publication of Lacan's écrits, where he says, you'll find this on page 306, my return to Freud has an entirely different meaning insofar as it's based on the subject's topology, which can only be elucidated through a second twist back on itself. Seminar 17, The Other Side of Psychoanalysis. He continues, everything about it must be restated on another side, so that what it hones in on can be closed, which is certainly not absolute knowledge, but rather the position from which knowledge can reverse truth effects. It is no doubt on the basis of a suture that was made at one moment at this joint that what we have absolutely achieved by way of science was assured. Isn't that also enough to tempt us to undertake a new operation where this joint remains gaping in our lives? You would have perhaps heard the resonance of two signifiers, commemoration and memorial. What kind of writing allows for a reading in psychoanalysis, and vice versa? What does it mean to look back over what the past has given us? That's it.
I'm sure that I join you all in conveying at least an initial sign of appreciation to Florencia for the wonderful trajectory she has followed through this very complex chapter, opening up, shall we say, some of the questions that follow right through the rest of the seminar, setting up some of the questions that we will be able to pursue over the course of the weeks to come. I'm also struck because I don't think Florencia will mind me letting you know that she did mention to me a certain sense of apprehension at having taken on such a complex chapter, and at the last minute suggested, well, I'm not quite sure how to go about this. And right at the start of her presentation, in terms of opening up the distinction between a doctrine and a teaching, she located the term, she produced the term inadequation. And I've got to say, that's provided me with a wonderful reference for following her path through some of these themes and thematics. that question of inadequation. She used that notion in particular in terms of an inadequation between knowledge and jouissance. But we see to some extent inadequation between production and loss, between truth and knowledge. So it may well be that inadequation turns out to be a profound guide, a profound compass point in our approach to these questions. If we could situate behind that notion of inadequation a touch of the impossible. And Florencia mentioned more than once, taking the quote from Lacan, I don't remember now, where the confrontation with the impossible has the effect of the renewal of a teaching. And if anything, Florencia's trajectory over the last minute has been, if anything, a testimony to the confrontation with the impossible that lies for all of us at the end of analysis, how productive this can be in terms of renewing and rendering fertile a teaching. We have many different questions and comments available. I'm not going to take up the time, except to just mention that the one reference I found most useful in getting to grips with this chapter is the question that isn't answered, which Florencia highlighted, the question you find on page 44, in terms of the difficulty we face in giving a reply to what constitutes the essence, the dominant in the university discourse. And it's almost Lacan's non-answer of that question, because you would think by this time we already have S2 in the place of the dominant in the university discourse, so why not say it's the S2 and proceed? He's already written that at the start. It's the non-arrival at the answer that we expect to that question that to some extent opens up the whole kaleidoscope that we lurch into with the whole third chapter, with the repetition, thermodynamics, entropy, jouissance, S1. But instead of proffering the S2 that we expect as the answer to the dominant place in the university discourse, instead, at the end of section 2, we arrive at the element of impossibility. Instead, he introduces the reference to impossibility. And that reference to impossibility almost opens the kaleidoscope of all the moving parts that we then track through this astonishingly complex third part of this day, in order to arrive in the fourth part at the question of truth and interpretation, almost as if it suddenly pops out of the box. We back to the position of the analyst and the question of interpretation, which Florencia itself guided us securely to that notion that what one expects from the analyst is to get knowledge to function in terms of truth. To some extent, taking up some of the questions that Vicente touched on last and opening up more questions for us to pursue over the weeks to come. I know that Colin Wright, a member of the London Society, has volunteered to take on the role of discussant for Florencia's presentation. I'm sure he will have a remark or a question to pose, and then I hope that each one of you will have some comments or questions of your own to raise in relation to the field that Florencia has opened so magnificently. Doesn't mean that all the questions will be answered, but we're entitled to put the questions to work. Colin?
Okay, thanks, Roger, and thanks especially to Florencia. So many questions, it's hard to know where to begin. In fact, in preparing, I did have a question, which actually turns out to be your question, which was to do with, yes, this issue of teaching. So if last week we had Vicente making clear that the previous session of the seminar is really about the master and the hysteric, the question here is the relationship, obviously, between the analytic discourse and the university discourse, and a relationship of untranslatability, that something is absolutely lost in translation there. And I also zoomed in on that beautiful sentence which ends the preface to Le Maire, which you quoted, "The amber which holds the fly so as to know nothing of its flight." Now, what that implies is that as analysts, we know how to allow the fly to fly and to make some know-how from its flight. But it does present a real problem for teaching. And it's noticeable in that first section that Lacan is reflecting on his own paradoxical position. To all intents and purposes, his appearance is as somebody in a university context teaching. But he's very clear to hesitate around that position. So really my very simple question is it's just reposing the one that you opened with, is really how to teach psychoanalysis without teaching it, or rather how to transmit something of our know-how in a way that doesn't fall into the trap of teaching. And I'm asking that to you also as an analyst of the school now, where there's a certain responsibility to engage perhaps with that third ring that you mentioned of the political, because a school also exists in the city, I think, as Jacques has put it. So it's really putting back to you that key question about the transmission of psychoanalysis in our current circumstances.
Thank you, Colin. Yes, I think it goes straight to the heart of the thing, because we are working on this seminar, which has as its context, let's say, only a few years since Lacan offered something as a response to the diagnosis that he had made in 1956. He offered it 11 years later, 10 years later. You know, the decade is always important. So 10 years later, he offered the proposition of the 9th of October, offering a solution, or at least what he thought was a solution, to the structural effects. We would say it with this seminar, we would say it a solution to the structural effects of discourses in the plural, because it's an illusion that something like the analytic discourse could exist as if in the ether, isolated. That this is where, in any case, the transmission that is expected from the analysts of the school is a transmission that can say with the utmost possible rigor the singular way in which that adequation between knowledge and jouissance failed for oneself. So that would be one aspect. The other aspect, which is in relation to the flight of the fly, of course, it's inevitable when one is really bathed with the signifiers of Lacan. They just function a bit like that. It's impossible not to, for me at least, not to connect it with the flight of meaning. And this is the real problem, because the other side of the petrification of the fly in the amber of a nicely binded thesis, PhD or otherwise, is the flight that's endless. And we also have this in both in the devices conceived by the properly speaking university structures, but also in the devices that Lacan created, and after Lacan, his followers for the teaching of psychoanalysis. You see, so you have this petrification in the amber and this flight, which is another, I don't know how to say it, but it's the infinite flight. Yeah. Mm-hmm. At some point, Philip, you're moving your mouth, but we are not hearing you.
I would say, I mean, I'm very delighted that you've used this quotation. It's perhaps one of my favorite quotes from Lacan. I always remember it as simply, the amber that holds the fly knows nothing of its flight. It's the flight, surely, of the flight of the signifier, insofar as it is related to what you pinpointed very specifically as the enunciation. And it links up to what Lacan says about interpretation being an enunciation which holds its statement, its énoncé, its signification. That in a way is the obverse of this university discourse, let's say, or what he's criticizing here, where everything becomes Lacan dit, Freud dit, resolved to the level of the statements, and we can approach it slightly differently as well. I think the university discourse also reveals in its writing that the consistency of that knowledge that's being sustained by the university discourse and put into action is also sustained by the S1, by the master that it conceals. And that's also something that's very interesting at stake there. Interesting, it's such a rich chapter, the way it relates to the La Planche Leclerc text. I don't know if you noticed, but the translation of l'inconscient, the text that Lacan's referring to in English in Yale French Studies, is the unconscious, a psychoanalytic study. And there's nothing that incarnates this amber better than precisely that title. That's a comment for you.
If I can just add something in the sort of broader context, as Florencia and you, Phil, were speaking, I was thinking about the opening session, I think of Seminar 16, where Lacan says in his usual enigmatic way that psychoanalysis is a discourse without speech. And I think Marie-Hélène reminded us of it in the opening of this series. And that already seems to me an important intervention at a moment when precisely Lacan's, a kind of Lacanian chatter, is being taken up within the university and deployed in a way that actually has nothing to do with the practice, the clinic. And so that intervention is already, in a way, making that distinction that actually Vicente reminded us of between the saying and the said.
Yeah, but do you know, Colin, I'm more concerned by, I'm not so concerned by that, by the fact that Lacan is taken up in university departments of literature, of gender studies, or of film studies. After all, one should try to follow or extract what is the logic of that, and it's not independent from what the legacy of Freud was made of in the English-speaking countries. So there's a whole chapter there, but I'm not so concerned about that. I'm more concerned about the petrification or the flight, the endless flight within the Lacanian orientation, in the sense that, yes, you can spend some time asking yourself, about people who call themselves Lacanians and what does it mean, and it's not very fruitful. I think what interests us in relation to the transmission of psychoanalysis is how not to fall prey of what Lacan himself denounced and showed happened with Freud. And I think this happens to us all the time. It happens to us when an analyst is, a professor in a university, or a chief of service in a big hospital, or and then one thinks, okay, but the transmission of psychoanalysis in the sense of the production of an analyst, and the production of an analyst is not the production of a professional, of a métier. It's not that. I don't have an answer to that, but I can tell you what are the things that by which I feel more concerned. And of course, the quoting, the citing. I'm going to do a little bit of self-promotion here, if you allow me. I very rarely do it, I think, but today I feel like it. There is a new issue of the online publication by ICLO-NLS that's coming out this week, where the main text, I'm not going to tell you who the author is, but you will find out, is what is the Lacanian orientation. And I think it's a great contribution for the English-speaking audience and people in general interested in Lacan's work. The question of the end, both as the ending point. Where does the flight of the flight take you? Where does it stop? But also the end in the sense of the finality, in the sense of how this inadequacy that Roger put closer to the impossibility, how not to turn it into an excuse for not ending.
Thank you, Florencia. We have a couple of questions posed by Patricia Tessada and later by Susanna Hula. So I know Patricia has been waiting patiently with her digital hand raised. So Patricia, if you can go ahead with your comment.
Okay. Thank you very much, Florencia. I liked it. I like very much all you said here about this difficult chapter. I would like to do some comments to see what you think about a question that you posed that I like it very much, because it's something that it always interested me. It's about teaching, and you asked, how can psychoanalysis teach what cannot be taught, right? So this is something I tried to investigate in the past, because it always interested me, and maybe I can say a few things to see what you think about this. On the one hand, I think it's important for analysts to differentiate the school from the institutes of the champ Freudian. And we have teachers in these institutes, right? But not in the schools. In the schools, we don't have the figure of the teacher. And once I read a text of Éric Laurent, I don't know if it is translated. In Spanish, it is on a text we have called From Oedipus to Sexuation. And there is a specific chapter about the impossible of teaching. And there, Laurent says that the analyst has no vocation of teaching. No vocation of teaching. So this is something that can make us think about how can we do ourselves in this big champ Freudian with teaching. So I think that nothing guarantees that a teaching results in knowledge. Because Lacan says that a teaching is not something that goes immediately from one side to the other and comes back. Lacan warns us that a teaching can make barrier to knowledge. Lacan says that in the other écrits, in the, I don't know how do you say in English, allocution about teaching. So on the one side, we analysts, it's important for us to be aware not to identify ourselves with that function, and to maybe to try to understand that the teacher, between brackets, is an effect. That is to say, I consider that that a certain analyst produced a teaching effect on me. So I consider that analyst could taught me something. What I want to say is that the teaching is an effect, and an effect in each one of us, never generalizing, of course, but it is an effect from us to the one who is in the position of a transmission of something, like in the past. I mean, like the testimonies. There are some testimonies that touch our bodies. Others, no. Maybe we need more time, or we need to read. So I think teaching has also this sort of effect. I don't know what you think about this. Thank you.
Yes, I agree. I mean, there's if it was something obvious, Lacan wouldn't have written what cannot be taught, how to teach it. It's the point of the paradox. It's the point of our struggle. I don't think that transmission and teaching are the same. Maybe we can leave that for another time. I do remember being very struck by how Lacan says of Ferdinand de Saussure that he was a proper teaching. So maybe we can all go back and read that. The position, of course, the teaching is an effect. In fact, in English, it sounds even worse because we don't have another word for teacher, and we do, at least in Spanish and in French. I think we find our bearings with a few words, at least 2 or 3. But then there are, in the history of psychoanalysis, there is no doubt that there are some analysts that had a great vocation for teaching. Then what we can go back to the discussion of what defines the position of the analyst. But and the same in the transmission that one encounters. One knows very well when in one's own formation, whether it's in the university, in a clinical section, in the school, in a seminar, in a cartel, or on the couch, one was the fly trapped in the amber. One knows it. Your body knows it.
Florencia, on that question of a vocation for teaching, let's not forget that the vocation immediately indexes let's say, the voice in its status as object. So, and Patricia also pointed out something about not identifying with the role, because Lacan in this chapter speaks about his own position teaching and makes that distinction, shall we say, opening that gap between teaching and transmission, where he says, yes, I occupy a role, but I don't identify with it. That could be maybe the distinction between identification with knowledge and supposition of knowledge.
Yeah, but for me, Roger, there is also the question, could Lacan have sustained his practice without his teaching and vice versa? And I think it's interesting. It's not to be answered too quickly.
But sorry, may I add one thing? I think at this point it is absolutely important to remember that he always did his transmission, his teaching, his seminars in a certain position. How do you say in English? Posición de analizante.
From the position as an analysand.
Yes, he did that from that position.
Not from the position of the analyst. Yes. We have two questions, I know, queuing, shall we say, one from Susanna Huller, one from Gustavo de Sel. We don't have unlimited time unless we explore time as a sequence of episodes, and we will have plenty of time to pursue these questions over the weeks. Susanna, if you can, Peggy, if you can unmute Susanna for her brief question, and then we'll make room for Gustavo and maybe one further for today. Susanna?
Very short. I like the way you read the chapter, and I thought you read it as an AAS, meaning when you have on your shoulders the task of teaching about something that is so singular as your analysis. When you remind us about the fly caught in the amber and that we forget the fly, I think we have to put this quote of yours together with something that Marie-Hélène Bruce said in the first meeting in the Zoom, which for me was very clarifying. She said something I always knew, but I never had this very good formulation of it. She said, when a truth becomes a doxa, it loses its power of elucidation. And we can add to that, it loses its power of having an effect of truth. An effect of truth is not a truth, it's an effect of truth that touches the drive, touches your way of enjoying. Meaning that what we are looking for is effects of truth, and we don't want them to become a doxa, as when we quote and quote and quote, and it looks like a doxa. That's it.
Thank you, Susanna. Yes?
We're going to move on to Gustavo, and then there's a question by Veronique Verrouz. But I will just say in relation to what Susanna Huller, maybe that gives us a link between what Lacan introduces in the previous chapter as the all knowledge, the universal, and then insists on in this chapter in terms of the half saying of truth. because at that point we see the non-adequation, the non-superimposition of knowledge on truth, because the aspiration of knowledge to the all-saying and the insistence on the half-saying of truth.
It's an articulation of the two commentaries, the one by Patricia and the one by Susanna. They're
intertangled.
Gustavo? Peggy, can you release Gustavo's voice? Thank you.
Now? Okay, Florencia, thank you so much for illuminating this really difficult chapter. For me, it's of a great help to link some aspects of this chapter, and I dare say the whole seminar, with that old text of Freud, very boring, I must confess, the project for psychology for neurologists. Because there is something that you have quoted about the mark, the unary trait as a commemoration of a reduction of jouissance, and what Freud calls there the experience of satisfaction. I think that those statements are very close one to each other. And I dare say that all the work of Lacan, the whole work, is an attempt to answer, and there's a repetition there, always the same question in different way: what a signifier is. From the very beginning to the end, what a signifier is. Because we have to deal this seminar and all others, the seminars that come afterwards, trying to grasp how to understand that signifier is the cause of jouissance, and at the same time to admit that the signifier, the unary trait, is the commemoration of an eruption of a jouissance whose cause we don't know which is. Do you mean what I mean?
Yeah.
Do we mean what you say?
It's... Yeah, let's go to Veronique. Gustavo, I'm going to think about that. I totally agree with reading this chapter with Freud's. The question is that the experience of satisfaction for me at this moment, in this apparatus of jouissance, yes, we have the dilemma that the signifier at the same time introduces jouissance and creates a loss of jouissance. Yeah,
the signifier is the cause of jouissance, and at the same time there is a jouissance that leaves as a mark, a signifier.
Yeah, the point. Well, I'll think about it, but.
Not every question has to receive an immediate answer.
Yeah, of course.
There's the productive aspect of it. Veronique might have a comment or a question, or a comment and a question. Veronique?
Thank you, Florencia, for structuring our reading of this chapter. It wasn't easy. I just wanted to perhaps add some context and to ask you about one dimension of the chapter which you've left a little bit to the side. First of all, this is the time at which Lacan is really trying to make psychoanalysis function against the grain of the unconscious. I think it's a really important shift in his teaching. The other side of psychoanalysis is the unconscious. So psychoanalysis is the other side of the unconscious. So then the function of the analyst needs to be radically overhauled if we begin to think of psychoanalysis as going against the unconscious as opposed to as functioning in the same manner as the unconscious. So what we really find, it seems to me, underpinning chapter 3 is the idea that we can no longer consider that transference has to do with the analyst as subject supposed to know or supposed subject of knowledge. And I think this is why Lacan is at pains to re-specify what knowledge is. Knowledge is simply the articulation of S2s with the unary trait. And that's a redoubling of the function of the lost object. If you understand, we really have this in chapter 3. We see Lacan says, Freud says that repetition is about the lost object. Lacan says that repetition is about the unary trait. And we have Lacan layering over, if you want, the thermodynamic conception that Freud has for repetition with his idea that repetition also has to do with the Markov language, and that knowledge can be accounted for in this way, if you want. And therefore, knowledge needs to be situated not as something which is unproblematic and can function in order to assist the subject with the conundrum of his desire, but knowledge is in itself a production that takes part in the function of repetition. And therefore, the analyst has to be situated elsewhere, and transference has to be reconceptualized. And this is why Lacan says that the analyst has to do with the function of the object A, represents that, but also the last sentence of the chapter, which I find absolutely amazing. Lacan's, if you want, nth rereading of the Jouissance of Schwerden. I don't have the English version, but it's the last phrase of the chapter. So.
I can read it, Veronique. The last sentence of the chapter, where Lacan says, yeah?
Maybe that whole, the last paragraph.
Last paragraph.
Yeah. It's very much there, just like that, within hand's reach. I nevertheless get the feeling, even now, that I am merely restating this. The work is mine, and the surplus pleasure is yours. What one expects from a psychoanalyst is, as I was saying last time, to get his knowledge to function in terms of truth. This is why he limits himself to a half-saying. I said this last time, and I will have occasion to return to it because it has consequences. It is to the analyst and to him alone that the formula I have so often commented on, this Jouissance soll ich werden, is addressed. If the analyst tried to occupy this place, which determines his discourse at the top left, he is absolutely not there for himself. It is there where the surplus jouissance, the other's jouissance, was that I, as preferring the psychoanalytic act, must come.
So it's absolutely fabulous because, first of all, Lacan is in bad faith. He's saying the Jouissance or Lichberg has to do with the analyst, like I've always said it. It's, of course, it's something stretch. So he's saying it there. And I find it extremely interesting because we are really dealing with the question of the operativity of the analytical discourse. And it's really what we are trying to work on, even with Eric Laurent's text in Barcelona about transference today. He talks about how can we think of transference beyond the analyst as subject to know. It's the question that we're still working on. What's in it for the analysm? What is it that the analysm gets out of being an analysis if the supposition of knowledge is no longer functioning at the time of the other that doesn't exist. And here we have it seems to me, something which is very precisely offering a theory of transference as having to do with the libidinal stakes of the analyst, and the analyst having to occupy this function in the analytical discourse, and that's why the analyst is a reject. The analyst is a reject. Mm-hmm. He is the one who doesn't get anything out of the discourse. He is the one that occupies this function simply in order to, if you want, to confront the analysand to his libidinal exigencies.
Yeah, I think it's a reformulation of what we can find in Direction of the Treatment when Lacan speaks of the payment of the analyst, the various payments of the analyst. But it's also, so you have that on the side of jouissance, but you have also that on the side of knowledge, the disarticulation of both terms with regards to the position of the analyst, because in a way, Lacan had said it already in the proposition, the analytic discourse also produces its own, the misrecognition, which you see the question between knowledge and savoir and connaissance and méconnaissance, the misrecognition of the real of the experience is not something that he who is in the position of analyst is exempt from.
What I find very interesting is that for Lacan, the analytical discourse produces an analyst, or somebody, at least who is the product of the analytical discourse, some of which will become analysts and so on, simply by virtue of the structure of the analytical discourse and not by virtue of any kind of knowledge that would decide a priori what it is to be analyzed and so on. So simply the analyst is produced by the operation of the analytical discourse because there is an analyst that occupies the function of agent. So it seems to me quite a radical proposition.
Could we maybe leave things in the air with the space opened up by Veronique's comments, almost something played out, shall we say, between the position of the analyst and the position of the analysand, where so many of these questions are played out. I also find very useful what Veronique's comments as making almost a bridge between last week's chapter presented by Vicente and where we will be going with next week's chapter on the idea of truth as sister of jouissance. Because that comment about the unconscious as written into the discourse of the master, posing the question of the analytic discourse against the unconscious, I think is consequences we are still pursuing today with Jacques Miller's help, making the distinction between a transferential unconscious and a real unconscious. And we find with the very formulation of the notion of the reverse of psychoanalysis, Lacan himself already going against the grain of the unconscious and opening up the position of the analyst as the object. Veronique's comment about the relation between transference and interpretation in that final section is maybe a useful reminder, or it brings back to mind for me, that in Seminar 11, there's a chapter towards the end of Seminar 11 that's entitled From Interpretation to Transference, I think. And so this chapter is not only a reminder when we return to the question of repetition, how much Lacan has moved on since his formulation of repetition in Seminar 11 to what he's reformulating now about repetition on the side of jouissance, but also the articulation between transference and interpretation is not at all what he might have, we thought, been formulated at the end of Seminar 11. These questions give us plenty to work on to assist us and contextualize each one of us in our own attempts to pursue these questions, bring them back to life. We have had a wonderful illustration today of the effects of transmission and the production of the effects of teaching by Florencia's confrontation, shall we say, with the impossible of this particular chapter. And we look forward to seeing you all again next week when Frank Rollier will be guiding us towards the questions at stake in Chapter 4, Truth, the Sister of Jouissance. Same time next week. Thank you all for your participation.